What the fuck? Those were the words I kept repeating to myself while reading The Sluts by Dennis Cooper. This is possibly the most fucked up book I have ever read. It's also one of the most impressive. I didn't think that at first. First, the book was just disorienting. I had a hard time keeping track of who was who, what each person wanted, what was true and what wasn't, what I was supposed to know versus what the author intentionally wanted to remain mysterious. Once I came to understand the book, I realized how perfect it really was. The Sluts is told entirely through message board posts, escort reviews, emails, and arguments between anonymous users online. Nearly all of them are lying, impersonating someone else, or working with incomplete information. To understand what's happening, you have to keep track of screen names, real names, fake names, rumors, alleged murders, and people who may be arguing with themselves through several different accounts. Brad, the prostitute the story centers around, might be one person using several different names, or he might be several different people using one name. Or he might not even exist. This book took me forever to read because I kept constantly having to go backwards. Wait, who is this username again? Is this the same Brian or a different Brian? Did this person actually meet Brad, or did the webmaster only confirm an email address? Is this a new murder or the same murder from before? Is any of this really happening? Or is one guy sitting at a computer talking to himself? Eventually, I started to wonder whether Dennis Cooper himself even knew the answers. Maybe he just threw 100 names and insane scenarios onto the page and trusted that nobody would look closely enough to see whether they actually fit together. So, I decided to be the one to look too closely. After finishing the book, I read it again. On the second read, I tracked every major alias, contradiction, disappearance, and supposed death. I tested every possible explanation of the ending against everything that came before it. I spent days building timelines, character maps, and case files. Here's a picture I took in the midst of an 8-hour session at my kitchen table, surrounded by papers like I was investigating a murder. After I finished studying the book, I searched for other attempts to solve it. I found essays, YouTube videos, and forum theories, but I could not find anyone who had mapped the entire novel from beginning to end. So that is what we're going to do today. Whether you read The Sluts and got completely lost, or have never heard of it before, the goal is the same. By the end of this video, you will understand the entire story as far as the evidence allows. But to do that, we have to experience the story the way the book gives it to us. I'm going to start by summarizing the novel from beginning to end. I'll introduce each character as they appear, and examine every major claim using only the information available at that point. To keep all of this straight, we're going to be building a running case map. Right now, that map looks like this. Each colored box will represent a person, account, identity, or story connected to Brad. Green means confirmed or strongly supported, yellow means uncertain, red means false or likely fabricated, and blue means the central identity or biography still under evaluation. The lines show how each piece may connect. As new names, aliases, contradictions, supposed deaths, and identity reveals appear, we'll pause for a brief case file update. We'll replace the placeholders, redraw the connections and the strongest evidence, fill in the timeline, and mark each major claim as confirmed, uncertain, or likely fabricated. By the end, we should have the strongest possible answers to all the book's central questions. Every mystery that can be solved will be solved. Let's begin our summary and analysis of The Sluts by Dennis Cooper. Content warnings are on screen now, so please pause if you would like to review them. The book begins on heading, Site 1. Beneath it is review number 1, which includes a customer questionnaire. Escort name, location, supposed age, rates, height, weight, hair color, sexual role, rating, whether the reviewer would hire them again. This review form is the closest thing the book has to a narrator. Every fact reaches us through a customer, and the website's webmaster chooses what gets posted. When he later says he verified someone, that usually means he exchanged an email or phone call with the account. It confirms contact, but not the person's identity, diagnosis, or story. For now, though, the page looks ordinary. It's just one man reviewing an escort named Brad. The reviewer is Big Man 60, a middle-aged man who says he likes very young-looking street hustlers. He finds Brad hanging around Pumpers, a bar in Long Beach where escorts wait for customers between jobs. Brad's identification says 18, but Big Man 60 says he looks no older than 14. Almost immediately, there are warning signs. Brad is extremely quiet. He will not name a price or describe what he's willing to do. He has a physical tic where he cranes his neck and opens his mouth. And before sex, he asks for alcohol because, in his own words, he has to be fucked up to do it. Big Man 60 writes, "There were warning signs everywhere, but Brad was so hot I just ignored them." At this point, Brad has spent about 30 minutes drinking whiskey and is visibly intoxicated. Because Brad will not name a price, describe his limits, or clearly state what he wants, Big Man 60 simply decides that anything is permitted. He performs oral sex on Brad for roughly an hour, pushes 4 fingers inside him, penetrates him as hard and deeply as he can, hits him, twists his nipples, and then has unprotected sex with him before finishing inside of him. During this time, Brad never becomes erect. His mouth remains open, and he makes noises that Big Man 60 says sound like fear and arousal at the same time. After Big Man 60 finishes, Brad spends the night whimpering and thrashing while Big Man 60 falls asleep beside him. Big Man 60 puts $200 on the dresser and wakes up to find Brad and the money gone. Brad has left a note with a phone number and a request. "Call me again," or "tell your friends about me." Alright, so this is the first version of Brad that we get. He's a homeless-looking boy who appears 14, asks for alcohol before the appointment, repeatedly cranes his neck and opens his mouth in a tic, accepts treatment that is dangerous, and keeps whimpering and moving even after the customer's finished. Every part of that description comes from a man who is proud of ignoring the warning signs because the sex was just so good. Then comes the second reviewer, LL Bean. He sees the first review and immediately wants the same experience of dominating a young-looking, defenseless boy. The phone number Big Man 60 left as Brad's contact leads to a homeless shelter. Shortly after LL Bean calls asking for Brad calls him back. They schedule an appointment, and LL Bean offers to send a taxi. Brad refuses and says he'd rather walk. However, that walk is roughly 10 miles and takes him more than 2 hours. Now, I interpreted this as Brad delaying the appointment. Maybe walking for hours was the only way that he could find a piece of control before giving himself away. But LL Bean takes it as a sign that Brad is just a little quirky. When Brad finally arrives, LL Bean confirms that he looks much younger than 18 and has to drink heavily before anything happens. He's very excited by the fact that Brad looks young. LL Bean handcuffs him to the bed, penetrates him with increasingly large objects, and eventually fists him. Brad screams in pain, but because he's hard, LL Bean interprets the screaming as enjoyment. LL Bean finishes, but he says that even afterwards, it was clear that Brad could have gone all night. He had to order Brad to get dressed and leave. He describes Brad as very out of it and says he was acting strangely, though he never explains exactly what that means. LL Bean writes, "Not into being some kid's father, so I could care less." He gives Brad a positive review and says he plans to hire him again. 2 reviews in, we have our first repeated details. A boy called Brad exists, or at least 2 people claim to have met him. He looks alarmingly young. He has some kind of twitch or seizure-like movement. He needs alcohol to function sexually. He appears to accept torture without limits. He has difficulty leaving the sexual state once the customer wants the night to end. It's like, once he accepts them, he doesn't want to be sent away. Next, review number 3 introduces Jose R72. Jose thinks he is the first decent person in this entire story. Jose says that he works in mental health. He admits that Brad is exactly his type and that meeting him required a high degree of self-control. But he claims he made the appointment with Brad only because he wanted to help him. According to Jose, he spoke with Brad, decided that he might be schizophrenic and suffering from a neurological disorder, enrolled him in an outpatient program, and arranged for him to live with a female acquaintance. Jose ends the review by telling the other customers, "Shame on you." He says Brad is no longer reachable at the old number, and, with any luck, nobody on the site will hear from him again. But then, somebody claiming to be Brad responds, apparently from Jose's computer. This Brad says Jose is a liar and a prick. He posts a new phone number, advertises himself as willing to do anything, says he needs somewhere to live, and writes that men like Jose are the worst because they promise help that they don't mean. The webmaster posts that he repeatedly tried to contact Jose and got no response. He recommends all users stay away from Brad until further notice. What Jose adds is not a verified diagnosis. It sounds like a rescue fantasy. Brad is no longer just a disturbed escort. He's now a mentally ill boy who one enlightened customer thinks he can save. But Jose's attraction to him never disappears. Even the rescue begins with him secretly booking Brad under false pretenses and deciding what should happen to him. Although this is of course much better than hiring him as a prostitute, this is still yet another person obsessed with control over Brad. Now, review number 4 comes from Bazeeb7, who ignores the webmaster's warning because he's in Los Angeles on business and decides Brad is worth the risk. So, he gives Brad a call. Brad tells him that he's nearby and will be at the hotel soon, but he takes more than 2 hours to arrive to Bazeeb's hotel. So, Bazeeb goes to sleep. At 3:30 in the morning, though, Brad appears at the room demanding alcohol. When Bazeeb says there is none, Brad sits on the bed and just starts crying. By this point, Bazeeb isn't even interested in sex anymore. He offers to take Brad to a liquor store and give him full payment plus a taxi home. However, Brad refuses and becomes more and more upset. He keeps asking, "Don't you like me?" Bazeeb says he agrees to have sex mostly because he's afraid Brad might be carrying a knife and wanted to make sure that Brad took his clothes off. The moment they begin, though, Brad calms down. Bazeeb says that Brad's naked body looks no older than 13 or 14, and this fact arouses him greatly. Bazeeb describes thrusting deeply into Brad's throat and then performing oral sex on him. As soon as he begins rimming Brad, Brad's entire body starts spasming violently. His mouth falls open and his eyes roll backward. Bazeeb believes he may be witnessing a seizure, but he says that watching Brad lose control just turns him on. While Brad is seizing, Bazeeb penetrates him without a condom and finishes inside him twice. He then masturbates Brad until Brad ejaculates, and according to Bazeeb, the spasms stop at that point. Brad is left drenched in sweat, exhausted, and visibly disoriented. But then, Brad suddenly begins screaming that Bazeeb raped him. Hotel employees arrive. Brad shifts between apologizing, begging to stay, threatening to call the police, and accusing the man of trying to kill him. Once Brad is removed from the hotel, he repeatedly calls Bazeeb's phone. He says he's lost and scared. He threatens suicide, then says that there is someone who wants to kill him. He says that if Bazeeb doesn't come get him, he may go to that person's house and allow it to happen, even though he doesn't want to die. Eventually, Bazeeb just gets fed up and turns off his phone. Now, the next review comes from a user named Brian. Brian says, "I'm the man Brad was talking about wanting to kill him." Brian claims that both of his parents died from brain tumors, so he recognized Brad's symptoms. He says he booked Brad, took him to a hospital instead of having sex with him, and paid for extensive testing. According to Brian, Brad has an advanced, inoperable brain tumor and will die within 6 months. Brian says that Brad now lives with him. He pays the medical bills and daily expenses. Medication reduces the seizures, but leaves Brad exhausted and irritable. The hotel encounter with Bazeeb supposedly happened during a 2-day period when Brad stopped taking the medication and disappeared. So for just a second, things make a little bit of sense. But then Brian explains what he wants from Brad in return. Brian says that his lifelong fantasy is to kill a boy during sex. Brad, he claims, is terminally ill, psychologically unstable, traumatized, and aroused by the plan. Brian says that his plan is to continue having sex with Brad, but when Brad becomes too disabled for the sex to remain exciting, he will end his suffering during sex. Until then, he says he will continue managing Brad's escort appointments. So essentially, Brian has manipulated the situation so that he has become Brad's lover, caretaker, pimp, and intended eventual killer. Next, the webmaster adds one more development. Jose, the mental health worker who claimed to rescue Brad, has reportedly been found severely beaten in his apartment and remains in a coma. The webmaster says there is no evidence that Brad is the one who attacked Jose. However, just placing that update directly beneath Brian's story about Brad, of course, encourages everyone to connect the attack to Brad. The webmaster also warns that Brian has never posted before and that another review arriving the next morning will challenge his account. The webmaster also warns that Brian has never posted before and that another review arriving the next morning will challenge his account of events. His claims, the webmaster says, should be taken with a grain of salt. All right, let's take a quick breather. Let's calm down for a second. Let's assess what's going on. Before the next review blows the story open, because trust me, it will, let's do our first case file check. All right, here's the first case map. Pause the video if you want to examine everything more closely, but I will be going over it. Starting in the center, we have Brad, a Los Angeles escort whose identity and history remain uncertain. The colors show how much support each part of the story currently has. Yellow marks information that remains uncertain, including accounts that come from only one source. Green marks details that are confirmed or strongly supported. And red is reserved for claims that prove false or were likely fabricated. Brian's dashed border shows that almost his entire biography comes from Brian himself. On the upper left, Big Man 60 gives us the first version of Brad. He says Brad looks around 14, is extremely quiet, asks for alcohol before sex, and repeatedly cranes his neck and opens his mouth in a physical tick. Below him, LL Bean gives us the second review. His account overlaps with the first in several important ways. Brad again looks alarmingly young, drinks heavily before the encounter, and later appears very out of it. Jose R72 adds the first rescue narrative. He claims to have a mental health background, says Brad may be schizophrenic, and says he enrolled Brad in an outpatient program and arranged housing for him. Jose is the only source for that diagnosis and supposed rescue, so none of that has been independently established, and so it's not necessarily true. Now, someone responds from Jose's computer claiming to be Brad, rejects Jose's version, and posts a new phone number. Though we can't actually verify who wrote that response. Now, Bazib7 adds the hotel encounter, another episode of extreme spasming or seizure-like behavior, and Brad's claim that somebody wants to kill him. That is where the thread begins expanding beyond disturbing customer reviews into a possible murder story. Then we get Brian. Brian says that Brad lives with him. He says Brad has a terminal brain tumor, and he presents himself as Brad's lover, caretaker, pimp, and intended killer. Brian's story appears to explain nearly every strange detail we've encountered. It also gives Brian control over Brad's housing, money, medical information, appointments, and the interpretation of Brad's behavior. So, on the right side of the map, we have the small, probable core. An escort using the name Brad likely exists. Several reviewers describe him as unusually young-looking, with one estimating that he looks around 14. Across the accounts, we also see recurring reports of heavy drinking, distress, physical tics, spasming, or other altered behavior. But the larger question remains unanswered. We don't know Brad's real age, his medical history, whether any of the diagnoses are accurate, or whether he was capable of giving meaningful consent, and the intoxicated and distressed condition those reviewers described. Remember, the webmaster cannot settle these questions. He says that he verifies things, but really he can only verify that certain accounts contacted him and that some emails or phone calls happened. That does not prove who was behind an account or whether the claims inside those messages were true. So right now, the strongest evidence consists of a few repeated observations. Brad's unusually young appearance, heavy drinking, visible distress, and abnormal physical episodes. The elaborate biography surrounding those observations is still being supplied by individual posters, especially Brian. For now, that is all the map can reasonably establish. Now, this information might feel a little bit redundant, but make sure to keep it in your head as we continue because things are only going to get more complicated, and you'll start to see that some refreshers are needed every so often. Let's get back to the book. The next morning, the webmaster posts the review he warned us about. Review number 6 comes from Bag Lover, who goes to Pumpers looking for the young escort described in the first Brad review. He asks the bartender about him, and the bartender points out a familiar young escort. It says that the escort's name is Steve, not Brad. Bag Lover recognizes Steve as someone he has seen around the bar before, usually drinking, smoking, or playing pool. At first, Steve seems completely different from the Brad described in the opening reviews. He's taller, heavier, more arrogant, and much more controlling. He charges an enormous amount for a very limited service. According to the regulars, Steve usually has customers lie beneath him and rim him while he masturbates. That's basically the entire appointment, and he demands extra money for every additional minute. But two details catch Bag Lover's attention. Steve looks extremely young. He has the same strange physical tics that were associated with Brad. So Bag Lover asks him directly, "Are you Brad?" Steve looks shocked. Then he admits that he sometimes does use that name. As Bag Lover explains the situation on the review site, Steve, or possibly Brad, also says that he knows nothing about the review site and barely knows how to use a computer. But then he takes Bag Lover back to his expensive apartment for their appointment. There's a brand new computer sitting in there in plain view. No homeless shelter and no signs of the terminally ill boy Brian described. Steve becomes cold, sits on Bag Lover's face while Bag Lover rims him, masturbates, takes the money, and refuses to do anything else. Now there are at least 3 possibilities. Bag Lover met the same Brad and exposed the earlier biographies as fiction. He met a different escort who sometimes borrows Brad's name, or Bag Lover invented the entire encounter to invent a new version of Brad into a story that everyone is already watching. Brian responds to Bag Lover's review almost immediately. First, he calls Bag Lover a liar. He claims the apartment was actually Brian's condo and says that he secretly watched the entire appointment. He says Bag Lover is an obsessed customer who keeps begging to eat Brad's feces. Then, in the same message, Brian advertises Brad as available for scat, urine, and other bodily fluid scenes. He says that all readers have to do is contact him, Brian, for details. Now, review number 7 introduces the most confusing name possible. Stevie. This is not Steve from Pumpers. Stevie is a separate escort from San Diego posting under the handle Cutie Stevie SD. Stevie is a separate former escort from San Diego posting under the handle Cutie Stevie and SD. He says he appeared in pornography under the name Stevie Sext and previously worked for an agency called Boys Next Door. Stevie claims that Brad also worked for that agency, but under the name Kevin. According to Stevie, Kevin came from a wealthy family, wanted to become the most famous escort in the world, obsessed over serial killers, claimed someone had offered him $1 million to star in a snuff film, and talked about procuring boys for wealthy men. Stevie also claims that Brian was Kevin's sugar daddy and that the entire terminal brain tumor story is a publicity stunt. But then Brian denies ever knowing Stevie. He says Brad grew up in foster homes in Texas and Oklahoma and never worked for an agency. He also says he remembers reading that Stevie is dying of AIDS. He ends by inviting Stevie to call him if he wants to go out with a bang. Next, Ed, a representative of the Boys Next Door escort agency, posts. It confirms that an escort named Kevin really did work for the agency and was fired because of concerns about his true age. But Ed cannot confirm whether Kevin later became Brad. He cannot confirm that Brian was Kevin's sugar daddy, and he warns that Stevie's illness may have affected his judgment. Review number 8 comes from a user named SecretLifer34. An older sadism and masochism top who says he met Brad in a chat room without knowing about the controversy on the review site. He pays Brad $800 for an evening of heavy use and abuse. The version of Brad in Secret Lifer 34's story is delicate, feminine, hyper, and extremely talkative. Unlike the Brad in the opening reviews, he does not appear drunk. Secret Lifer tapes his mouth shut, repeatedly knees him in the testicles, penetrates him with increasingly large objects, shocks his groin with a stun gun, and whips and tortures his chest, stomach, thighs, and genitals. Brad remains hard throughout, and Secret Lifer treats that bodily response as permission to go further and further. When they're done, Brad becomes needy and begs Secret Lifer to stay or take him home. Secret Lifer writes in his review that once he's used someone, he becomes bored and contemptuous. He punches Brad in the face, leaves him bleeding on the floor, and admits that, by the next day, he cannot stop thinking about doing it again. Now Secret Lifer also adds a new identifying detail. He says that Brad has a tattoo of Christ's face on his upper back. And after looking at the old Boys Next Door photographs, Secret Lifer says that Brad does not resemble Kevin whatsoever. Then Brian responds to the review and claims that the encounter never happened, or that Secret Lifer met another escort impersonating Brad. Then Stevie jumps back in and counters that Kevin really did have a Christ tattoo and that everything else in Secret Lifer's review sounds exactly like him. That tattoo feels like strong evidence because it's so specific, but remember guys, once Stevie has posted that detail publicly, anyone writing a review on the board can reuse that detail to seem to add credibility to whatever narrative they want to spin. So next, Secret Lifer posts again. Secret Lifer says Brad first called him from a payphone, then arrived at Secret Lifer's house with a swollen eye, dried blood, a broken wrist, bruises, whip marks, cigarette burns, and chemical burns around his shaved crotch. Brad claimed to Secret Lifer that Brian had inflicted these injuries while beginning to carry out their murder agreement and had lost his nerve before finishing. With him, Brad brought bottles of seizure medication that he claimed had been prescribed because of his brain tumor. Secret Lifer urges Brad to report Brian to the police, but Brad refuses, saying he would rather die this way than die in a hospital. Then, Brad asks to use Secret Lifer's phone to call Brian for permission to continue with whatever he and Secret Lifer had discussed. Here's the thing. Call is obviously fake. During the phone call, Secret Lifer can hear the recorded message repeating, "At the tone, the time will be," but Brad continues pretending to speak with Brian. He then tells Secret Lifer that Brian has approved their plan on condition that Secret Lifer transfer $20,000 into Brian's account. Secret Lifer says he cannot arrange that payment until the next morning, so Brad pretends to ask Brian whether that is acceptable. Then, he announces that Brian has agreed to this plan. Secret Lifer cannot decide whether Brad is psychotic, neurologically deteriorating, acting brilliantly, or constructing an elaborate suicide fantasy. But he goes along with it because the craziness excites him. Secret Lifer claims he cut Brad, beat and whipped him until he could not stop the bleeding, broke his nose and jaw, possibly broke his neck, and poured lighter fluid on his genitals and anus before setting them on fire. At one point, he believed Brad had died. But when Brad showed signs of life, Secret Lifer says he could still not bring himself to finish the murder. He left Brad trapped in the playroom, screaming to be killed. He then gave Brad Valium and ended the review by asking the website what he should do next. Then, Brian jumps back in and changes his old story. He previously claimed that the encounter never happened. Now, he admits that Brad and Secret Lifer did meet, but he says Secret Lifer lied about nearly everything and pushed the scene far beyond what they had agreed to. Brian also admits that he and Brad had fought, and that Brad ran away. He begs anyone who knows Brad's location to return him, offers a substantial reward, and says that their relationship is as sacred as a marriage. Then the webmaster posts saying that he strongly suspects Stevie wrote Secret Lifer's reviews and may also be the person posing as Brian. But he can't prove it. At this point, the person supposedly exposing the Brad scam may also be writing the scam. Lover defending Brad may be the same person attacking him, and every new correction creates another possible impersonator. Next, review number 10 comes from Corey, another San Diego escort whose email and contact the webmaster says he authenticated. Corey says he recently participated in a three-way with an escort introduced as Brad, but Corey recognized him as Stevie Sext. During the ride home, Stevie allegedly said that he was seriously ill and wanted to become famous by being murdered in a snuff film. He also supposedly admitted that he had taken the name Brad to lure Brian into killing him. Stevie then tells Corey about the missing Boys Next Door escort named Kevin. He claims that Kevin was murdered in a real snuff video, that an ex-lover showed him the tape, and that he later stole it. Corey announces on the board that he plans to visit Stevie's apartment on Sunday to watch the video and investigate. He posts the plan publicly because he believes the intention will discourage Stevie from doing anything dangerous. Webmaster confirms that Corey is the one who sent the email. Ed confirms again that Kevin existed, was fired from the agency, and later went missing. That still doesn't prove that the tape exists, that Kevin was murdered, that Stevie stole anything, or that Stevie is Brad. Then, Secret Lifer returns for review number 11. He announces that Brad died at exactly 4:27 in the morning. Secret Lifer claims that a professional sadism and masochism performer he calls Rex contacted him and agreed to kill Brad for money. On the drive to the house, Rex allegedly confessed that he had already participated in 2 filmed murders. One of the supposed victims was porn performer Chip Knoll. Secret Lifer then describes an alleged video in which Knoll was drugged, placed in a metal tub, scalded with boiling water, cut apart with scalpels, and raped after his death. By connecting Rex to this supposed earlier film, Secret Lifer makes Brad's death sound like part of an existing underground snuff network rather than an isolated murder. According to Secret Lifer, Rex arrives at the house, takes one look at Brad's injuries, and strangles him to death within minutes. Allegedly, Rex then helps dismember Brad's body and discusses where the remains should be dumped. He also examines the prescription bottles Brad brought with him and identifies them as seizure medication. So that detail might support the claim that Brad suffered from seizures, but it doesn't prove that he had a terminal brain tumor. And it still comes to us only through Secret Lifer's account. Secret Lifer says that Brad's murder is complete and the mystery is finally solved. However, the webmaster does not believe him. Emails sent to Secret Lifer's address bounce back, and Hotmail reportedly says that no such account exists. The webmaster therefore tells readers to treat all Secret Lifer reviews as a prank. So that doesn't necessarily prove that the underlying encounter was fake, but it does destroy Secret Lifer's credibility as a verifiable witness and leaves the murder, dismemberment, and body disposal story completely unsupported. Then, review number 12 appears from Ren Adams, an established professional sadism and masochism top. Ren says he believes he is the man Secret Lifer called Rex, but his version removes nearly everything sensational from Secret Lifer's account. No murder, no dismemberment, and no snuff conspiracy. Ren says a man hired him to perform an extreme sadism and masochism scene with the man's boyfriend. They met at a bar, discussed the terms, and then drove to the house. Ren says the boyfriend looked suspiciously underage, although the client produced a driver's license listing himself as 18. Ren writes, "If he was 18, then I'm the Queen of England," but immediately excuses himself by saying that determining whether identification is legitimate is not his responsibility. According to Ren, he subjected Brad to a 3-hour professional sadism and masochism scene involving severe pain and repeated threats. But he insists that the threats were roleplay, that Brad's life was never in danger, and that Brad was still alive when he left. The webmaster then chimes in and claims that he spoke with Ren by phone and received enough private details to make him believe Ren is telling the truth. So, Ren is the most strongly verified source in this section. Still doesn't prove that his version is accurate, though. Ren obviously has reasons to minimize what happened, and because the webmaster never reveals the details that persuaded him, we can't independently test his account or just believe him. So we now have Brad, Steve, Kevin, Stevie, Brian, Secret Lifer, Corey, Rex, and Ren. Some of them may be separate people, some may be aliases, and some may not exist at all. So before we go any further, let's jump into our next case file and make sure we all understand exactly what's going on. So Brad, of course, remains at the center, but even his identity is becoming unstable. We now have several people connected to the name, and we can't assume that they're all the same person. On the left, we have Steve, the pumper's escort from Bag Lover's review. A bartender identifies him as Steve, and Steve allegedly admits that he sometimes uses the name Brad. That is the strongest direct connection between two identities so far, but it still comes entirely through Bag Lover. Steve also conflicts with the Brad described in the opening reviews. He's taller, heavier, more expensive, more controlling. He lives in an upscale apartment and enforces strict limits. So Steve may be Brad, but it's very uncertain. Above Brad, we have Kevin. Kevin's existence is strongly supported. Ed from Boys Next Door confirms that an escort named Kevin worked for the agency, was fired because of concerns about his real age, and later went missing. What we don't know is whether Kevin later began using the name Brad. That connection comes mainly from Stevie, the separate San Diego escort who posted as Cutie Stevie and SD and previously worked under the name Stevie Sext. Stevie claims Kevin later used the name Brad and that Brian was Kevin's sugar daddy. The Christ tattoo may seem to support that story, but again, once Stevie posts that detail publicly, anyone writing afterward can reuse it. So Kevin and Stevie are both strongly supported as separate escorts. But Kevin becoming Brad is still only a claim, and Steve and Stevie are definitely not the same person. Brian is going to stay in a dashed yellow box because his story just keeps changing. He first says the Secret Lifer encounter never happened, but then he admits that the first encounter happened, but claims Secret Lifer lied about almost everything. Brian also says Brad ran away, which directly conflicts with the later claim that Brad died. Secret Lifer remains uncertain. The first violent encounter may contain a real event, but all three escalating reviews come from the same username. They are not independent witnesses confirming one another. The claimed death sequence moves into red. Secret Lifer says Brad died at exactly 4:27, that Rex helped dispose of the body, and that the medication confirmed Brian's medical story. But emails to Secret Lifer's address bounce back. Hotmail reportedly has no record of the account, and the webmaster tells readers to treat the reviews as a prank. Corey is gonna stay yellow. The webmaster verifies that Corey sent the message, but that only confirms contact. It doesn't verify Corey's claims that Stevie was posing as Brad, that Kevin appeared in a real snuff film, or that the tape exists. Then we have Rex and Ren. Ren Adams is an established professional whom the webmaster contacts by phone. Ren says he believes he is the man Secret Lifer calls Rex. That makes Rex probably Ren, but not conclusively. Ren also has strong reasons to minimize what happened. his reputation, his career, and of course, he doesn't want to go to prison. I haven't included this in the summary thus far because I think that hearing it over and over would become kind of taxing. But for each review, users have to write the escort's eye color, height, and weight. Throughout the novel, Brad is described with 7 different heights, 10 different weights, and 4 different eye colors. Either several people are using the same name, reviewers are inventing details, or maybe both. So the best reading we have right now is that Steve may be Brad. Kevin is strongly supported as a separate escort. The claim that he later became Brad remains unproven. Stevie is probably separate. Brian's story is completely unstable. Secret Lifer may have built an elaborate death story around a real violent encounter. Rex is probably Ren, and there is still no reliable evidence that Brad is dead. With all of that said, let's get back into the book. All right, so Ren has just reduced the supposed murder to an extreme appointment that may have crossed a line. Then the site returns to Stevie Sext, separate San Diego escort who claimed Brad once worked as Kevin. Now, review number 13 comes from Big Red, one of Stevie's former regulars. He says Stevie contacted him after more than a year away from escorting. According to Big Red, Stevie has developed AIDS, spent most of the previous 2 weeks unable to get out of bed, and arrives visibly skeletal, pale, and weak. Big Red describes himself as an aggressive marathon top with a 14-inch penis who specifically prefers small, thin, boyish partners. Instead of treating Stevie's condition as a reason to stop, he says the weight loss makes Stevie look even younger. He has Stevie perform oral sex, spanks him until his skin is red, rims him, crudely describes the lasting physical damage by years of heavy bottoming, and penetrates him as hard as he can before ejaculating inside him twice. By the end of the appointment, Stevie is sweating, nearly colorless, collapsed on the floor, and too weak to stand. Big Red finally feels something resembling guilt, but even that reaction remains selfish. Seeing Stevie helpless makes him imagine Stevie's body dead and decomposing, and he mourns that Stevie's death will be a huge loss for him. Then Stevie answers the review himself. He denies writing the Brad post, explains that illness costs him his graphic design job, and says he's escorting because he needs to survive. He states plainly, "I don't want to die. I'd do anything not to die." The webmaster responds by apologizing for blaming Stevie. He admits that there's no evidence that he wrote the earlier reviews, but he still leaves the accusations around him in place. He also reverses his position on Ren after a supposedly trusted contributor claims Ren privately admitted that the scene went too far and then disappeared. Once again, the webmaster is using private messages that readers can't inspect as if they settle the public record. Frustrating, isn't it? The webmaster also admits that the Brad controversy has dramatically increased traffic to the website. That is a small but crucial detail. The webmaster keeps presenting himself as a reluctant moderator and third-party, unbiased individual who wants the story to calm down. He's also benefiting from the attention. The site and the webmaster himself have an incentive to keep Brad unresolved. That's not proof of anything, but it is something to think about. But then, review number 14 appears to bring Brad back from the dead. A man named TikTok88 says he picked up a bruised hitchhiker in Marin County who claimed that he was 14 and that his father had beaten him after he came out as gay. The boy offered sex in exchange for $200. And TikTok88 agreed. Afterward, once they are back in the car, TikTok says the boy's physical tics, or little seizures, became increasingly dramatic. His behavior also changes. He becomes sarcastic and asks what police would do if he reported that TikTok had sex with a 14-year-old. When TikTok asks his name, the boy says Brad. The name, the tics, the youthful appearance, and the sudden personality shift make TikTok believe this might be the original Brad. Those traits match the earliest reviews, so this is pretty convincing. But by now, every regular reader of the site knows exactly which details create a convincing Brad. This might be Brad. It might be another vulnerable boy using a famous name, or it might be a reviewer building the Brad everybody already expects. The webmaster apparently conversates with TikTok privately over email and declares the review credible. But all he's verified is that TikTok can answer follow-up questions in a convincing way. That confirms contact between the reviewer and webmaster, but it does not confirm the hitchhiker's identity. Now, review number 15 comes from Love Sexy. a longtime contributor who immediately treats the entire Brad saga like entertainment. He jokes about movie rights and celebrity casting before explaining that he contacted Stevie through the address attached to his profile. The person answering insisted on being called Brad. He accepted travel arrangements to a Los Angeles appointment, but then he never appeared. This failed booking creates another identity problem. Stevie may have been using Brad's name. Someone else may have controlled the account. Lovesexy may have been deceived, or the entire booking story may be just another performance for the thread. Immediately after that post, the webmaster reports that Stevie Sext, whose real name he gives as Kenneth Miller, has been found dead inside his San Diego apartment. He says authorities are investigating and may connect the case to other deaths in the area. Within this novel, this is the strongest claim so far that a person attached to the thread has actually died. But we're still receiving the information through the webmaster's summary of an alleged news report, not through the report itself. The timing makes Lovesexy's no-show even stranger. Somebody using Stevie's account was arranging travel shortly before the reported discovery, possibly during the period when Kenneth was already dead. That could suggest account access by another person, a false timeline, or a fabricated booking. Review number 16 finally moves the story to Portland. Built Like a Truck 44, a construction contractor, says a 16-year-old boy named Brad asked him for work. This Brad has severe tics affecting one side of his body. He works quietly, arrives with his girlfriend, and appears to be trying to build an ordinary life. During a ride home, Brad tells Built Like a Truck that he previously worked as an escort in Los Angeles and lived with a man named Brian. When Built Like a Truck mentions the website, Brad seems shocked. He reads the threads, quits the job the next morning, and says the first few reviews are true, but almost everything afterward is false. According to Brad's account, Brian found him through the site, offered financial support, and gradually gained control over his housing, education, appointments, and money. Brad says Brian invented the terminal illness and the idea that Brad wanted to die. He then describes one arranged encounter becoming genuinely dangerous, followed by another attack from Brian, and then his eventual escape back to Portland. So if Built Like a Truck is even broadly telling the truth, this is the strongest realistic connection the book has offered so far. A young escort worked in Los Angeles. Brian found him through the website, gained control over his housing and appointments, and turned their dangerous relationship into public mythology. At least one extreme encounter may have happened, but Brad survived, escaped, and returned to Portland. That reconstruction explains more evidence than the elaborate death stories do. It also gives Ren's post a possible place in the timeline. Ren could be the third man in the encounter that Brad describes. Ren may believe he participated in a negotiated scene, while Brad remembers a moment when the limits collapsed and Brian encouraged far more serious harm. Their accounts can contradict each other without either one of them being completely invented. But Built Like a Truck is not an objective witness. He learns the history from Brad after becoming sympathetic toward him. Brad may be telling the truth, may be simplifying his own role, or he may be giving the first story that makes him look like someone escaping abuse rather than someone at the center of a scandal. Still, compared with the earlier theatrical accounts, Portland feels grounded in ordinary details. There's a job, a girlfriend, a ride home, embarrassment, a sudden decision to disappear from work. But then Corey returns in review number 17. He claims he went to the address where he'd previously seen Stevie get out of a cab. When he got there, he expected to watch the alleged snuff video of Kevin, but a blonde man in his early 30s answers the door, introduces himself as Brian, and tells Corey that Stevie will be back soon. Corey says the man appears intoxicated and immediately makes him empty his pockets. Corey places his knife and mace on a table, and Brian then leaves him sitting alone in the apartment. After waiting for roughly half an hour, Corey decides to leave. But just then, the man returns holding a gun, orders him back onto the couch, and points it at his head. According to Corey, Brian threatens to either have him beaten so severely that nobody will ever hire him as an escort again, or to kill him personally if he tells anyone about the visit. He then claims that Stevie is already dead and that his body is lying in the bedroom. Corey refuses to look because he believes Brian may kill him too. Brian allegedly says that Stevie had spent weeks begging to be murdered in a snuff film. He claims he came to San Diego, spent several days having sex with Stevie, killed him, recorded the murder, and now wants Corey to watch the tape. Corey refuses and somehow manages to talk his way out of the apartment. At the time, he's not sure whether any of it was real. He says he only begins taking the encounter seriously after learning that Stevie Sex's real identity, Kenneth Miller, has actually been found dead. The story is so scary because it makes so many of the rumors from before appear to be true. Brian exists. Stevie really did want to die. Brian murdered him. The body is still in the next room. The snuff tape exists, and Corey narrowly escaped becoming another victim. But that's also what makes the account suspicious. It resolves every uncertainty in the most sensational possible direction, and Corey posts it only after Kenneth Miller's death has given the fantasy a real body to attach itself to. Nothing independently confirms that the blonde man was Brian, that Corey entered the apartment, that a body or tape was inside, or that this account happened at all. The webmaster says that he's finally shutting the thread down. He now believes Built Like a Truck and thinks most of the Brad reviews were fabricated. He also says authorities have seen Corey's message and consider it likely to be a hoax, although they will investigate regardless. Then, despite supposedly ending the spectacle, he announces that Brian has submitted one final review and deserves the last word. So, review number 18 comes from Brian. This is his retraction, confession, defense, and attempt to regain control of the story. He opens by saying that it's time to come clean. According to Brian, he hired Brad after reading the earliest reviews, then offered to support him financially if Brad moved into his home. This confirms that at least Brian's newest version begins the same way as Brad's Portland account. Brian discovered Brad through the website, became his customer, and then gained control over his housing and money. Brian also admits that the terminal brain tumor story was false. He now claims that Brad had described a fantasy in which he was dying from a brain tumor and customers killed him because they could not bear to watch someone so beautiful waste away in a hospital. Brian says they turned that fantasy into the advertisement for a dying escort because it made their private relationship more exciting and attracted greater interest from customers. Brian then supplies a completely different explanation for Brad's tics. He claims that they resulted from brain damage after Brad was accidentally dropped on his head as a baby. Neither explanation is independently verified, but the change matters because Brad has now withdrawn the medical diagnoses that previously justified his control over Brad's medication, housing, appointments, and supposed end-of-life decisions. Brian then redirects nearly all responsibility onto Brad. He describes him as a pathological liar, a control freak, and someone whose overriding need was to be desired and worshipped. He claims Brad repeatedly begged him to murder him, flirted with him about it, and threatened to find another man willing to do it whenever Brian refused. Brian even suggests that Brad interpreted his survival as proof that he was not attractive enough to inspire murder. So this becomes the central defense of the post. Brian admits increasingly serious conduct, but he argues that Brad designed the fantasies, demanded the escalation, and psychologically drove the adults around him beyond their normal limits. That version directly conflicts with the account Brian reportedly gave Built Like a Truck. Brad said Brian invented both the terminal illness and the claim that Brad wanted to die. Brian now says the fantasy originated with Brad and was developed by both of them. The novel never gives us independent evidence capable of settling that contradiction. What we do know is that Brian was the older person providing Brad with money and housing while also arranging his customers and promoting the idea that he wanted to be killed. Brian confirms that Wren participated in an extreme encounter and claims it nearly became fatal. He also admits that, days later, he carried out a severe attack of his own and intended to kill Brad before Brad escaped. So even Brad's self-defending version contains an admission of deliberate, potential fatal violence. Brian also claims that Secret Lifer privately admitted fabricating the 3 detailed death reviews out of jealousy. Brian denies knowing Stevie, denies meeting Corey, and denies any involvement in Kenneth Miller's death. Conveniently, every other storyteller becomes the liar, while Brian becomes the one man finally telling the truth. So, I don't know, I believe parts of Brian's last post more than his earlier story because it retracts a major lie and admits behavior that makes him look terrible. But it's still almost perfectly self-protective. The false illness is Brad's idea. The obsession with death is Brad's manipulation. Wren becomes the truly dangerous outsider. Secret Lifer becomes the jealous fabricator. Corey becomes someone trying to frame him. Brian confesses while still casting himself as the victim. The webmaster then reports that an arrest warrant has been issued for Corey, whose real name is David Barrows, in connection with Kenneth Miller's death. The man who accused Brian is now the suspect. Again, this is information filtered to the site, but it completely reverses the emotional force of Corey's post. Built Like a Truck also sends a correction. He says Brad left 10 messages after fighting with his pregnant girlfriend, then called from a bar associated with street hustlers and asked to sleep on his couch. When Brad arrived, Built Like a Truck says he was heavily intoxicated, pushed his way inside, demanded money for his girlfriend's abortion, broke objects, and threatened to tell the police that Built Like a Truck had raped him. After being thrown outside, Brad alternated for about half an hour between threats and begging to be let back in for sex. And hours later, Built Like a Truck's business burned down. He says Brad was arrested and apparently confessed to starting the fire. So first, Brad was Brian's beautiful, dying victim. Then he became Built Like a Truck's quiet young employee trying to escape his past. Now he's described as manipulative, addicted, threatening, and an arsonist. Those portraits can coexist. Victim doesn't have to be innocent or easy to like, but every portrait also comes from an adult who needs Brad to be a particular kind of person in order to explain their own choices. The webmaster decides that it's best to remove the Brad reviews from Site 1, but then he creates a separate message board for future updates, rumors, and arguments. So now people no longer need to claim they hired Brad in order to participate in conversations. They can investigate him, defend him, repeat stories, and add any new theories that they want. So at this point, Brad is no longer just an escort being reviewed. He's a serialized mystery and a community project. The story has escaped the original review format, and the audience is now helping to write it. Ooh, okay, let's check back in for a second, guys. All right, I made a little graphic to help, so you can check back in, look at that, pause if you need to. Now that Site 1 is over, here is the version we can carry forward without pretending the contradictions are solved. A young escort called Brad probably existed, looked unusually young, had severe tics, and worked in Los Angeles. The terminal illness is almost certainly false. A real encounter involving Ren probably occurred, but Ren, Brad, and Brian describe its limits differently. The overlap suggests one incident rewritten by people protecting themselves. The best supported reading is that Brad survived Brian and returned to Portland. Secret Lifer's death sequence is probably fabrication built around fragments of the real event. Stevie appears separate, and nothing reliable links his reported death to Brian or proves the Marin hitchhiker was Brad. So the center is Brad, Brian, control, a dangerous encounter, escape to Portland, and arson. Around it, the website adds terminal illness, murders, recordings, impersonations, and conspiracies. The lies work because they grow around something that may have happened. So, with all of this in place, the book now steps away from Brad and takes a very strange detour. This is called Box 157. So now, Brad, Brian, Stevie, and the webmaster disappear. The escort reviews are replaced by personal ads and phone conversations centered on a wealthy customer using the screen name Box 157. This shift completely widens the book's focus. Instead of following one young escort surrounded by rumors, Cooper shows us the largest market that made the Brad story possible. Box 157 contacts young men and adults offering access to young men who advertise desperation, no limits, or a willingness to accept almost anything for enough money. The first ad comes from a 19-year-old calling himself Juicy LA Boy. His pitch is simple. He'll do anything for a price and has no limits. Box 157 answers by offering $5,000 and warning that what he wants is dangerous enough, as something could go seriously wrong. The young man hesitates, then keeps negotiating. He's frightened by the implications, but the money pulls him back into the conversation. Box 157 asks him to bring childhood photographs so that, if the night ends badly, the result will feel more tragic. The exchange never gives us a confirmed meeting, but what it does give us is the pattern. Somebody advertises desperation or unlimited availability. Box 157 searches for the exact point where the willingness to accept torture collapses, or where the price becomes high enough to keep it alive. The next ad belongs to Todd, an 18-year-old who describes himself as straight, addicted to heroin, and looking for a wealthy man who can keep him supplied. Todd says he wants to be controlled, humiliated, and physically abused, but repeatedly he draws one clear boundary: no sex. Box 157 immediately begins working around that limit. He offers Todd an unlimited supply of heroin, questions him about abuse in his childhood, and gradually treats access to the drugs as dependent on Todd accepting sexual acts he never advertised. Todd keeps returning to the same boundary: no sex. But Box 157 reframes crossing it as a test of their commitment to the arrangement. When Todd says he can drive himself to Box 157's house, Box 157 insists on sending a cab. He literally says that he does not want Todd to be able to control when he can leave. Next, a third ad comes from Qui, a Thai immigrant who says his English is limited and that he urgently needs money for his family. Box 157 sends an extremely violent proposal. He wants to murder Qui. Qui asks for $10,000 to be sent to Thailand and agrees to meet. But once they are together, it becomes obvious that he doesn't fully understand what Box 157 is saying. Instead of stopping, Box 157 gives Qui crack and keeps reducing the question to simpler language. He first says, "I definitely have to kill you." Qui answers, "Sorry?" After Qui smokes more, Box 157 asks whether he will allow himself to be killed. Qui says yes, but when Box 157 asks whether he understands, Qui apologizes again. Box 157 simplifies it further. "You die. You, and then I kill you. Me, kill you." Qui continues saying yes, even though his answers show that he does not understand what is being proposed. Box 157 eventually says, "You don't understand what I'm talking about, do you?" Qui again says sorry, but instead of stopping, Box 157 tells him they will drive somewhere. He promises to send money to his mother and gives him more drugs. The exchange ends without revealing what happens after they leave. Fourth major exchange begins with Box 157 posting an ad as a Dr. Jack Kevorkian type, which basically means he's the type of person who wants to help someone die. He says that he's seeking a thin, terminally ill man between 18 and 24, and he promises to take care of anything the man wants in return. Wayne, who is 18, answers even though he never claims to have a terminal illness. He describes himself instead as tired of his life, uncertain whether he truly wants to die, and burdened by debts that he once paid before anything happens. Box 157 keeps pressing Wayne for a firmer commitment. Whenever Wayne hesitates, expresses fear, or tries to place conditions on the arrangement, Box 157 treats that as evidence that he's not serious. He argues that someone who genuinely wants to die should surrender control over the method and accept whatever Box 157 decides to do to him first. The exchange ends without confirming that they ever meet, and without Wayne ever giving the clear, unqualified agreement the original ad requested. Then, the section becomes even uglier because several ads are not written by the proposed victim at all. A man named Hank offers his 18-year-old boyfriend as the ultimate experience in exchange for freedom and money. A later caller appears to offer his cognitively disabled son. None of these episodes give us a clean, externally confirmed outcome. Some may be roleplay, some may be scams. Some callers may be exaggerating because the offer is enormous. But whether the meetings happened is not the only point. Box 157 is testing the marketplace around Brad. He looks for addiction, language barriers, debt, disability, dependence, or a controlling third party. Anything that can make a person say yes while having less and less power to leave. I think that's why the book interrupts the mystery here. Brian didn't invent the appetite that gathered around Brad, and the site didn't create men who wanted a person with no limits. Brad became special because the internet gave that appetite a name, a serialized biography, and an audience. By the time the novel returns to his story, the community no longer only wants to hire him. They want to rescue Brad, expose him, possess him, solve him, and eventually decide how his story should end. When Brad reappears, though, the original review thread is gone. In its place is a separate message board the webmaster created after closing Site 1. The format has changed. Customers are no longer posting individual reviews of alleged appointments. Now, the entire community can argue, investigate, raise money, share rumors, and build new versions of Brad together. The new board begins with what sounds like charity. Donations to help Built Like a Truck rebuild after the arson, and a fundraiser meant to prove the escort review community contains caring people. But the discussion quickly reveals that their interest is no longer mainly about charity or sex. The murder story is what made Brad special. The same posters can condemn the fantasy, admit they share it, make jokes, and return to fact-checking within a few lines. Investigation has become entertainment. That becomes literal when a splinter group starts a separate discussion board devoted to violent fantasies about Nick Carter, fantasies about torturing and killing him. In these fantasies, the younger Nick is, the better. First appears as a grotesque joke. Brad is too complicated, too morally dangerous, so they move to a celebrity whose image can be shared without anyone believing they have access to the real person. Nick Carter becomes their safely unreachable Brad. Now, this sideboard shows exactly what changes when everyone knows the target is imaginary. With Nick Carter, they can say whatever they want and call it fantasy. Brad is different because there may be a real person behind the name. They want the story to feel real enough to be exciting, but not real enough that they have to take responsibility. By now, the mystery itself is what keeps this group together. If Brad were ever truly explained, half of them would have no reason to stay around. Built Like a Truck returns with a Portland update and introduces Elaine, Brad's girlfriend who is 15 years older than him. She says she has known Brad since childhood and is now pregnant with his child. She contacts Built Like a Truck to argue that Brad needs treatment rather than prison. But Brad has received 8 months in minimum security prison. Another user then claims that an Oregon article identifies him as Brad Gordon at Sacramount Prison and includes a blurry photograph. So Brad's last name has finally entered the story. Within seconds, the board is discussing sending Brad love letters, gifts, visiting him, and detailed fantasies about the picture, all the things that they want to do to him sexually. Built Like a Truck reminds them that Brad is supposedly a mentally ill 16-year-old, not an empty image. But one user answers that fantasy cannot be policed because he has never met Brad. Built Like a Truck draws the line at contacting Brad directly, but that distinction collapses immediately. Elaine then appears on the board under the username E. Garrison. She warns everyone not to lure Brad back into self-destruction, but then she offers access to Brad. For a $100 donation, users can submit questions, and she says Brad will answer them from prison. Built Like a Truck says that this is probably a scam, but then Elaine responds by rewriting Built Like a Truck's arson story. She says Built Like a Truck exploited Brad sexually. He withheld pay from Brad, provoked the breakdown, and only requested leniency after she threatened to expose him. Built Like a Truck counters that Elaine controls vulnerable street boys through drugs and money. He admits first meeting Brad through a paid encounter, but insists the construction job was real. Brad wanted to escape her, and Elaine worsened his instability by withholding medication. The dispute cannot be settled. Both sides confirm Portland, Brad, Elaine, the job, fire, pregnancy, and exploitation while assigning every ugly motive to the other. Each needs Brad to prove a version of themselves. Next, a user who paid Elaine receives a supposed message from Brad. This apparent Brad says he misses Brian, resents Elaine, wants to live for his future child, and accepts some responsibility for provoking Brian while accusing Built Like Truck of exploiting him. Voice moves between loneliness, vanity, anger, guilt, and self-defense, which does make it feel psychologically coherent. However, we have no way of knowing if Brad actually wrote this message. It could really be from anyone. Regardless, the user and the board receive exactly what they paid for. A Brad intimate enough to feel private, and unstable enough to feel real and exciting. Lane then claims that Anthony Villani, Built Like a Truck's real name, has been arrested on child molestation charges after she reported him. She also says Brad was caught misusing his prison email access, fought with 2 guards, and was punished by being moved out of minimum security prison and into the general prison population. Elaine says that this cuts her off from Brad and puts his life in danger. Then, she bitterly tells the board that it can now fantasize about whatever may be happening to him. Instead of backing away, the posters immediately treat the news as another mystery to follow. One asks, is this for real? Is that a stupid question? Then, a user named Snazzy Stocky claims he has an acquaintance working in Sacramont's administrative office and says the man may be willing to share confidential information because he's gay. That supposed inside contact soon becomes the board's new source for stories about Brad's life in prison, even though none of it can be independently verified. Almost the exact same moment, a new authority figure arrives, a user named the Gay Journalist. He claims to write for The Advocate and to have sources inside the Kenneth Miller case. He supplies names, legal theories, alleged forensic evidence, stories about hidden recordings. Then, the supposed prison source sends Snazzy Stocky a story in which a guard is secretly trading email access for sexual control over Brad. Apparently, other prisoners are waiting for this protection to fail so that they can have their way with him. The board reacts not with concern, but with bids, predictions, and fantasies about Brad's death and everything that's happening to him in prison. Another user posts part of an alleged Brad email setting a price for being killed after his release. This user asks for others to contribute. It's like a GoFundMe for the honor to murder the great escort, Brad. Then, a skeptic named Buttons999 finally says the obvious. Maybe the board has returned to exactly where Site 1 began. One or more people are using public facts about a real Brad Gordon to stage a collective fantasy. There is no photograph linking Portland Brad to the original escort, no trustworthy prison source, and no reason to believe that someone inside the prison is negotiating his future death by email. Then, someone named Jimmy Taylor jumps in. Posting under the username JT, he says he and two other boys have been writing the paid emails while pretending to be Brad, both for amusement and to exploit the people willing to pay. He also claims Elaine had not spoken to Brad since he went to prison. Jimmy then addresses Brian directly. He says he has something Brian will want to buy once he sees it. He instructs Brian to meet him at the Spotlight Bar in Hollywood at 1 in the morning. He says that Brian should place a beer on the jukebox and follow the first man who leaves. Elaine then jumps in and confirms that the email operation was fake. She blames Jimmy, describes him as a volatile Portland hustler, and says he has disappeared with a 13-year-old neighborhood boy named Philip, who idolizes him. She fears Jimmy is planning to sell Philip to Brian. A new user called Someone1 then claims Jimmy has been dealt with and that Philip is still alive. He directs the board to a newly posted review as proof. A former customer challenges him to identify Jimmy's unusual tattoo. Someone1 answers that Jimmy has the word tool tattooed inside his right armpit, along with a large scar on his left ankle. But then the customer realizes that both of those details were already described in Jimmy's earlier reviews. So the supposed proof only proves that Someone1 read the site. Lane's friends offer up money for the boy's release. Then a user named Extra Cute Bill becomes their negotiator. Someone1 refuses email and contacts this person privately. Bill later posts that he accepts whatever was proposed. The board can see that a deal exists, but they have no idea what the deal is. Then comes the line that confused me more than almost anything else in the book. Someone1, now signing himself as Brian, posts a public amendment to the private instructions. He says to Bill, publicly, change 7 to 9, change 1134 to 873, remove Stan, 20 minutes. This is all the board receives. And no, we haven't missed a page. The original private message is never shown. So there's no master cipher for us to solve. Substitutions probably alter a time, address, phone number, password, or meeting instruction. But the exact meaning is unavailable. Bill understands because he received the original instructions. The board and the reader only see the corrections. Later, the gay journalist publicly sends Brian questions about Stevie's death, the alleged recording, Corey and Ren's roles, and whether Brian also killed Kevin. Brian replies with a mock obituary announcing Philip's death, then claims Stevie repeatedly asked to be murdered on camera, that Corey helped him carry it out in a private dungeon, and that they moved Stevie's body back to his apartment afterward. He also ties Ren to earlier snuff stories and suggests Corey may have killed Kevin, allowing one anonymous confession to explain nearly every unresolved murder at once, and place Brian at the center of all of them. But a skeptic immediately points out practical problems. If the body had been moved and staged, investigators would know. The gay journalist responds with a secret police source who conveniently confirms that exact missing fact. The journalist then offers Brian a personal reason to meet. He claims that, as a teenager, he survived an attempted murder by a known serial killer. Then Jimmy Taylor posts from an internet cafe in Tucson. He's alive. He says no Brian ever met him. He intended to rob whoever appeared. The younger boy is safe. An Extra Cute Bill doesn't exist. He also says Elaine isn't a criminal mastermind. He simply regretted the email scam, and Jimmy left with the money. Then a poster named The Stinge finally performs the most useful reality check. He has searched for news coverage of the murders, kidnappings, police hunts, and missing people, and found almost nothing. He knows the Portland street scene and says the elaborate network around Elaine is unknown there. The one detail he can substantiate is that a 16-year-old boy named Brad Gordon was convicted of arson and released from Sacramount prison. Snazzy Stocky then jumps back in and admits that his prison guard relative never existed. He did receive a message from someone claiming to be Brad, but he now assumes Jimmy Taylor wrote it. Webmaster announces that the board will close. He admits that Brad once brought enormous traffic to the site, but says the discussion now creates complaints, legal risks, and declining business. During the final hours of the board being up, another Portland poster named Earl Jackson confirms a much narrower Elaine and Brad story. He says Elaine is a massage therapist who once counseled street kids. Brad was one of those kids. He later followed an older man to Los Angeles, returned to Portland, became involved with Elaine, and went to prison for arson. Earl thinks Elaine is generous and Brad is manipulative. His judgment may be biased, but the broad biography overlaps with Built Like a Truck. But then somebody finally recognizes the gay journalist as Zach Young. Former partner posts that Zach isn't a journalist. Zach Young is not a journalist. He is a highly intelligent software designer with an obsessive fixation on the Stevie, Brad, and Brian story. Then, a poster calling himself the real Brian arrives. He says he is the original Brian from Site 1 and has never posted on the board. He denies the Stevie and Corey stories, the Jimmy meeting, the kidnapping, and every board confession attributed to him. The only later facts he repeats are the narrow Portland ones. Brad committed arson, served time, was released, and is now with Elaine, who is pregnant. Then the gay journalist, aka Zach, drops the mask. He admits he was never reporting for the Advocate. He admits posting as Brian and as a number of other key players, but he refuses to identify every account. He says the board gave him exactly what he wanted. The supposed real Brian has provided him a route to meet the supposed real Brad. Zach ends his post by promising that Brad will be available for hire again soon. And that is the real ending of the board. The most committed hoaxer on the site now has access to the person he's been searching for. Zach has been manufacturing evidence, interviewing himself, answering his own objections, and using the board's skepticism to improve the next version. The person most obsessed with solving the story has also been the one writing it. Okay, we need to break this down, so let's jump into case file number 3. Okay, here it is. Layer 1 is the probable Portland core. Brad Gordon, Elaine, construction work, arson, Sacramount prison, release, and continued life in Portland. Several hostile sources repeat that broad sequence while fighting over motives. Layer 2 is the access economy. Elaine sells supposed prison answers, and Jimmy later says that he and 2 other boys wrote them. Snazzy Stocky eventually admits that his prison source never existed. Jimmy says the younger boy is alive and Execute Bill is fictional, while the coded rescue, Philip's death announcement, and sweeping board-era Brian confessions either collapse or remain unsupported. Layer 2 is the access economy. Elaine sells supposed prison answers, and Jimmy later says that he and 2 other boys wrote them. Snazzy Stocky eventually admits that his prison source never existed. Jimmy also says Philip is safe, and that Execute Bill was fictional, which leaves the coded rescue plan, the later posts claiming Philip had died, and the sweeping board-era Brian confessions either disproven or unsupported. Layer 3 is Zach. The gay journalist is exposed as Zach Young, and Zach admits using the name Brian and posting through other accounts without giving a complete list. That proves he manufactured part of the board, but it does not tell us which Brian posts were his, or make every anonymous account automatically Zach. So the simplest way that I can make sense of it right now is that there probably was a real Brad Gordon, and several different people were using his story for their own reasons. Zach studies every version of the story and claims the supposed real Brian has given him a way to reach someone who may answer as Brad. Now the board disappears, and Zach's search moves into private correspondence with whoever that person is. Oof, okay, back into the book. After Zach claims he has found a route to the real Brad, the public board disappears from the page. What replaces it is a stack of private emails and faxes addressed to Brian. After Zach claims he has found a route to the real Brad, the public board disappears from the book. What replaces it is a stack of private emails and faxes addressed to Brian. The change in form is immediate. Nobody is arguing underneath the messages, and for the first time, Brad seems to speak continuously from his own voice. The writer, apparently Brad, Says he is in Portland, sleeping in his van, relapsing after several months of sobriety, and attending AA on and off. He says Elaine married him and is pregnant. The relationship collapsed. He has a restraining order against him, and he admits that he gave her a reason to get one. He is broke, alone, and trying to understand why Brian has suddenly contacted him again. He also describes the emotional structure of their old relationship more clearly than anybody has before. He says Brian treated him as special, and he both needed that feeling and hated the pressure of living up to it. He made Brian into a father figure, tested him, withheld affection, and felt guilty when Brian finally became dangerous. He says he has continued selling access to himself because he can't hold a job, but he needs money, drugs, shelter, or simply something just happening in his life. This is why the correspondence feels more convincing than the public posts. The writer doesn't sound like a perfect victim or a perfect monster. He sounds ashamed, manipulative, frightened, lonely, and extremely practical at the same time. He can say he loves Brian, ask for money in the next sentence, and openly admit that the love may be part of that transaction. But the private setting doesn't make the writing verified. Zach is already pretending to be Brian. He controls which side of the exchange we receive, and we never see the messages that prompt these answers. Intimacy is being used as evidence, even though the channel itself belongs to a known impersonator. This writer agrees to travel from Portland to Los Angeles, but the plan immediately becomes tangled with drugs and self-destruction. He says he may be able to obtain stolen drugs before leaving and admits that he has attempted suicide in the past. He had considered using the drugs to make another attempt, but he says Brian's renewed interest has given him a possible reason to keep living. Even so, he continues treating Brian's willingness to hurt or kill him as proof that Brian still wants him. Brian refuses to simply send him cash. So the writer, again supposedly Brad, asks him to purchase a prepaid bus reservation instead. During the travel arrangements, he says the ticket must match the name on his identification. The name on his identification is Thaddeus Stroh, not Brad. Who the fuck is Thaddeus Stroh? He misses the first trip and asks Brian to purchase another ticket. As Brian adds conditions, the writer promises that he will follow Brian's rules, obey his instructions, and tolerate whatever Brad wants him to do. But he repeatedly asks Brian to confirm that he still loves him. He also admits that he's frightened and believes there is a real possibility that Brian intends to kill him. When the writer finally reaches Los Angeles, another problem appears. He says a man named Harold is holding him hostage over a $5,000 debt and will not release him unless Brian pays. The writer begs Brian for the money, but Brian doesn't come himself. Instead, he sends another man to Harold's house to examine the situation. And who do you think that man is? It was Zach. Zach showed up to examine the situation. Zach showed up to examine the situation and hand over the money. What? The $5,000 debt is then exposed as another scam. The writer admits that he helped Harold invent the situation because they expected Brian to pay and that he was supposed to receive part of the money. According to him, Harold then cheated him out of his share. He's now stranded in Los Angeles, using drugs, staying with another customer, and repeatedly asking Brian for enough money to escape. So he proposes a new arrangement. He will stay with Brian for 1 week, allow Brian to advertise him as an escort again, pimp him out, and use the money he earns to return to Portland and finally live near his child. As Brian's on-scene replies become more threatening, the writer pushes back. He says, "I do not have a death wish." He accuses Brian of turning an old fantasy into a real plan and admits that he's scared. He also tells Brian, "You know I don't have a choice," because he has no money, no stable housing, no way to leave. Almost immediately, he changes direction again. He promises that he will love Brian, return to school, live with him, follow his rules, and give him whatever access he wants, as long as Brian will just take him in. Then, get this, Zach eventually admits that he has been the person who has been writing as Brian. Writer realizes that Zach is also the stranger whom Ryan supposedly sent to Harold's house during the fake $5,000 debt crisis. In other words, Zach had pretended to be Brian in messages and then appeared in person while acting like Brian's representative. The writer, again, is apparently Brad. He's still furious, but he's stranded in Los Angeles, using drugs and without stable housing or enough money to return to Portland. So, instead of ending contact, he makes the arrangement openly transactional. If Zach gives him money, drugs, and somewhere to live, he will continue performing the version of Brad that Zach wants. He will say that he loves him, repeat the tragic biography, and act like the doomed, self-destructive person Zach has been trying to find. The writer then explains what that performance involves. He says Brian wanted him to be extraordinary, doomed, impossible to save, and destined for a violent ending. He admits that he knows how to play that role, even though doing so sometimes depresses him. Then he introduces a new claim that he is seriously ill. He agrees to continue with Zach and arranges for Zach to collect him late that night. By the end of the correspondence, Zach has not proven that he found the original Brad Gordon. What the messages establish is much narrower. The person answering as Brad knows Brad's Portland biography, says the name on his identification is Thaddeus Stroh, and continues negotiating to perform the Brad identity even after Zach's impersonation is exposed. Okay, y'all, I'm getting confused again. Let's jump into case map number 4. At this point, the private correspondence is about to become public again. Zach is preparing a new escort site built around the Brad name. Before that site opens, we need to separate two people whose stories appear to be merging. Brad Gordon is the probable Portland teenager connected to the original escort reviews, Brian, the escape, the fire, prison, Elaine, and the later life in Portland. Private correspondent knows that biography, but says the name on his identification is Thaddeus Stroh. He's homeless, addicted, and willing to perform the role of Brad in exchange for money and shelter. Zach has been writing to him as Brian. Even after Zach's deception is exposed, both men continue negotiating. The best reading is that Zach has not found the original Brad Gordon. He's found someone willing to carry the Brad name. If you want to examine everything in a little more detail, go ahead and pause now. Everything is explained as clearly as I could in this case map. Back to the book. Zach now takes the private arrangement public. He launches a new escort review website advertising that Brad has returned and is available for appointments again. From this point forward, I'm going to call this website Site 2. It's separate from the original review site, but it deliberately reuses the same two identities at the center of the story. The manager calls himself Brian. The escort is advertised as Brad. The private correspondence has already given us reasons to doubt both names. We know Zach has been writing as Brian, and the person answering as Brad said that the name on his identification was Thaddeus Stroh. So, Site 2 begins with a substitution already in progress. Zach appears to be stepping into Brian's role, while the private correspondent is being placed inside Brad's. Because this is a separate website, the review numbering now starts over at 1. Site 2 opens with review number 1. Customer named Sandman808 calls a private number advertised for Brad and speaks to a manager who introduces it. A customer named Sandman808 calls a private number advertised for Brad and speaks to a manager who introduces himself as Brian. The manager says Brad is undergoing a private testing period before being advertised publicly. He offers Sandman a reduced rate in exchange for feedback and tells him that he will remain in the room to observe the appointment. Sandman immediately recognizes the names. He believes he's being given private access to the legendary Brian and Brad from the original website, but the young man he meets does not closely resemble the Brad from the earliest reviews. Sandman describes him as blonde, thin, passive, and unhealthy looking. He keeps on a long-sleeve shirt and does not display the severe tics, hyperactivity, or talkative personality attached to previous versions of Brad. But the manager responds with an explanation for every discrepancy. Brad is older now, prison changed him, medication controls the tics, physical and emotional damage have made him quieter. Sandman leaves believing he met the real Brad largely because the surrounding story feels convincing. The webmaster hesitates to publish the review, but then contacts both Sandman and the man calling himself Brian. That confirms that messages were exchanged and that some kind of appointment apparently occurred. It does not establish who either man actually was. Review number 2 describes an encounter that allegedly happened before the new site opened. The reviewer says he attended a group appointment at a private home where the host bragged that he and his boyfriend had already been posing as Brian and Brad. According to the post, the impersonation had worked well enough that they were preparing to turn it into a larger, organized business. The disguise begins slipping during the encounter, though. The boyfriend repeatedly addresses the host as Zach, then catches himself and switches back to Brian. Because it happens more than once, the reviewer leaves convinced that Brian is only the name being used for the scam and that the host's actual name is Zach. This becomes the first concrete link between Zach Young and the man now managing the Brad website. The webmaster contacts the reviewer and the person presented as Brian and concludes that the encounter did occur. Again, that only verifies contact and an apparent meeting. The accidental use of Zach's name strongly suggests that the man managing Site 2 is the same Zach Young who impersonated Brian on the board. So the fake journalist has apparently also become the fake Brian outside of the website. Review number 3 comes from Horny Nice, an established reviewer who pays the unusually high fee mainly because he wants to interview Brad. Horny Nice says the young man confirms much of the Portland biography. He says he went to prison for arson, had a failed marriage, and returned to escorting because he had nowhere else to live. But when Horny Nice asks about the advertised murder fantasy, the young man denies wanting to die. He appears relieved when Horny Nice says he only wants to talk rather than carry out the extreme appointments Zach has been promoting. Horny Nice also describes him as older, calmer, and physically different from the Brad in the early Site 1 reviews. Zach does not deny that Horny Nice hired the young man being sold as Brad. He denies that they spent the appointment talking. According to Zach, Horny Nice punched Brad hard enough to give him a bloody nose and a split lip, then licked the blood from Brad's face while masturbating. The webmaster confirms the booking with both Horny Nice and the man calling himself Brian, but accepts Horny Nice's version because he is an established reviewer, and Zach refuses to let the webmaster question Brad directly. And that becomes a recurring limitation. The entire business depends on the escort's identity, history, and supposed desires, but Zach controls access to him and speaks on his behalf whenever his own account is challenged. Review number 4 is where the question of identity temporarily becomes less urgent than what is happening to the person Zach is selling. The reviewer Bones for Puppy says he found an advertisement for Brad, who was being marketed as an 18-year-old escort. Before arranging for the appointment, the reviewer described a long-standing fantasy involving a teenage boy whose legs would be deliberately broken, leaving him immobilized and in severe pain, while the customer sexually assaulted him. According to the reviewer, Zach did not reject the proposal. Zach quoted a fee of $7,000 for 3 hours and acknowledged that the injuries would leave the young man unable to work normally for some time. When the customer arrives, Zach requires him to sign a confidentiality agreement and demands payment in advance. The customer initially refuses to pay before seeing the escort. Zach allows the young man to enter the room. The customer decides he matches what he requested, and the payment is made. The reviewer says the 3 of them partied until the young man was intoxicated enough for the planned violence to begin. The reviewer also says that he asked Zach more than once whether he should stop. Each time, according to the reviewer, Zach instructs him to continue. During the same appointment, the reviewer claims that he sexually assaults the young man and deliberately breaks both ankles, both knees, and both legs in several places. Toward the end, the reviewer claims that Zach quotes an additional price to kill the young man. No amount is given. The reviewer says he initially thought Zach was joking, but became less certain after learning more about the Brad story. The webmaster says he verified the review with both Bones for Puppy and the person calling himself Brian, who we now have strong reason to identify as Zach. Zach acknowledges that the young man can no longer walk or stand without assistance, and that both legs are in casts. He also announces, and this is crazy, that future customers will be required to prove their familiarity with the Brad story before being accepted. Zach claims that the injured young man wants his suffering to be appreciated by people who understand his status as a legend. Zach then converts the injuries into a new product. Because many customers cannot afford the original high fee, he advertises a reduced appointment costing $300 for 1 hour. Customers may look at the young man and engage in limited sexual contact while he remains immobilized in bed. Zach prohibits most contact with the injured lower half of the body, but continues selling access involving Brad's face, mouth, and upper body. Review number 5 comes from So Great, who purchases one of those $300 appointments. The reviewer says he must first pass Zach's quiz, sign an agreement, pay the fee, and submit to a search because photography is forbidden. He nevertheless conceals a small digital camera and brings it inside. According to the reviewer, the same young man is lying naked on his back in bed with 2 broken legs. Zach has already announced that his legs are in casts. The young man, again apparently Brad, appears unhappy, says nothing during the appointment, and remains under Zach's supervision at all times. But the customer finds an opportunity to secretly photograph the young man's face and posts the image online. Zach initially calls the review false and disputes the photograph, But Sandman808, the first Site 2 reviewer, says the photograph shows the same person he met during his earlier appointment. So that doesn't prove the photographed person is Brad Gordon, but it does support continuity across the early Site 2 appointments. First customer, the post-injury customer, and the later discussion appear to concern the same young man. Now, the photograph gives the board something it has never possessed before: a stable face that can be compared against the different people previously called Brad. Almost immediately, the identity claim begins to completely collapse. Review number 6 describes continued access to the same immobilized person. So guys, the continuity across reviews 4, 5, and 6 matters. Review 4 alleges catastrophic fractures. Zach then says the young man cannot walk or stand and that his legs are in casts. Review 5 finds him immobilized with 2 broken legs and supplies the photograph. Review 6 describes another appointment while he remains immobilized. So at this point, the sequence strongly supports continuous serious injury and exploitation. And then at around the same point, the webmaster reports a resolution to the separate death of Stevie Sext. Corey, whose legal name is given as David Burrows, has reportedly pleaded guilty to murdering Kenneth Miller. That reported conviction provides Kenneth's death with a much firmer explanation than the earlier stories involving Brian, Brad, and a supposed snuff film. Review number 7 comes from a man who says he was formerly a surgeon at a respected hospital before being forced into early retirement after a lawsuit. A friend who knows his fantasies tells him about Brad and helps arrange the appointment. Because Zach now requires customers to prove that they know the Brad story, the friend allegedly passes the screening by pretending to be the surgeon. The surgeon then pays $10,000 for an overnight appointment. When he arrives, the young man is still immobilized by the injuries from Review 4. Zach and the surgeon carry him into the kitchen and position him over the sink. According to the review, Brad is awake and initially cooperative, but nobody tells him what the customer actually intends to do. The surgeon first sexually stimulates him until he ejaculates, because he wants to be the final orgasm of Brad's life. Only then does Zach reveal the real plan. Customer intends to castrate him. Brad becomes terrified, screams at Zach, begs the surgeon to reconsider, and struggles to get away despite his broken legs. Zach pulls his arms behind him, binds his wrists, and helps restrain him. When he continues resisting, they inject him with a sedative until he becomes so disoriented that he cannot even answer simple questions. The surgeon then claims that he numbs the area, cuts away Brad's testicles, cauterizes the wound with a small blowtorch, and stitches the remaining skin closed. Zach allegedly hits Brad in the face and stomach to keep him conscious enough to understand what's happening. Brad begins wailing, vomiting, and losing control of his bowels as the operation continues. Afterward, they carry him back into the bedroom. The reviewer claims that Zach places the removed testicles in Brad's mouth, then tapes it shut. The surgeon then rapes him while Zach beats and threatens him until he attempts to chew and swallow his own testicles. The appointment ends with an agreement between Zach and the supposed surgeon. The man will act as Brad's private doctor and treat whatever injuries future customers inflict. In exchange, he will be allowed sexual access to Brad during those visits. The webmaster says he cannot verify the reviewer. Zach nevertheless responds as though the event happened, announces that Brad has now been castrated, and tells future customers to account for that when booking him. He also finally admits that the photograph posted after Review 5 really does show the person he is selling as Brad. Zeeb7 says the face does not belong to the Brad he met at the airport hotel. TikTok88 says it does not match the Marin County hitchhiker who called himself Brad. People connected to Portland also say the photographed person is not Brad Gordon. So these identifications are not all equally reliable or necessarily independent. Everyone can see the same photograph and read the same discussion, but the disagreement becomes increasingly difficult for Zach to contain. Zach eventually admits that he is not the original Brian. He still refuses to end the business, though. Instead, he argues that the substitution should not matter because his relationship with the young man resembles the original Brian's relationship with Brad, and because customers are still receiving the experience they paid for. In other words, Zach treats Brad as a product specification. As long as the performer can reproduce the right biography, young appearance, damage, dependency, a controlling manager, and a supposed death wish, Zach considers the identity interchangeable. But then Built Like a Truck returns. He says the actual Brad Gordon is alive and near Portland. Then, a poster named Benny Babixi enters the discussion. He says he produced and directed an amateur video called Portland Barebackin' Off the Streets, featuring 5 young sex workers he found at a Portland hustler bar called the Red Queen. Benny says he recognizes the person in the site to photograph as one of the performers from that video. He knew him as Thad, not Brad, but he is careful about the limits of that identification. He only spent about 3 hours with him, does not know whether Thad was his legal name, and cannot explain how he later became involved with Zach. All he remembers is that Thad uses drugs, claims to have grown up in Los Angeles, and talked about eventually becoming rich and famous. But even that limited identification creates a sudden rush of interest in Benny's old video. The original copies sell out, and people begin contacting him to ask whether he has any additional footage of Thad. He says there are no unused scenes from the original production, but he has located a separate 85-minute recording made by one of Thad's Portland customers, a man named Albert. Benny arranges to distribute that recording and retitles it Portland Barebacking, the Brad Tape. Benny's statement is useful, but it's still limited. He only knew Thad for a few hours and cannot confirm his full name or background. Review number 9 provides much stronger evidence because it comes from a customer named Snared by Boys, who claims he had an ongoing relationship with the person in the photograph before Site 2 existed. The reviewer says he hired the Portland escort 7 times over roughly 1 month and always knew him as Thad. He describes picking him up at an area where Portland street escorts worked, watching him lose weight over the course of their meetings, and repeatedly hearing him describe himself as doomed. During their final meeting, however, Thad seemed unusually affectionate and optimistic. He said that something was about to happen and that he was finally going to become famous. Around 8 weeks later, the same face appears on Zach's website under the name Brad. The webmaster says he questioned the reviewer and received enough private information to believe that the man had genuinely known the person in the photograph. Still not external proof, but it gives us a much fuller prior history than Benny's 3-hour video shoot. So taken together, the evidence now forms a chain. The private correspondent gives the identification name Thaddeus Stroh. Benny recognized the photograph as a Portland performer he knew was Thad. Review 9's writer says he hired that same person repeatedly, and Thad's prediction that he was about to become famous fits his disappearance from Portland and reappearance in Los Angeles as the legendary Brad. So the photograph immediately splits the board. Some users want to rescue the injured person, while others remain focused on buying access, obtaining more evidence, or learning what happens next. One poster even complains that the story has become too upsetting now that the suffering may be real. Review number 10 comes from a customer calling himself The Basher, a 61-year-old man who describes himself as a well-known figure in the Los Angeles leather community and an expert sadist. He says he had followed the Brad story with skepticism, booked an appointment after seeing the photograph because Zach promised that customers were allowed to cause permanent damage. The advertised price is $5,000 for 2 hours. By this point, the young man is supposedly already immobilized by his broken legs and has been castrated in Review 7. The basher says he strangles him nearly to death, threads his back with whips, and sexually assaults him while he's restrained. He then attaches electrodes to the young man's penis, sends electrical shocks through it, whips it until it's bleeding, and burns the entire shaft with a cigarette lighter until the young man loses consciousness. Zach's response makes the alleged result even more extreme. He says the damage to the young man's penis is so severe that it will be amputated the next day to prevent infection and to allow him to urinate. Zach then advertises the remaining mutilations like a schedule of upcoming appointments. The young man's face has been reserved for one customer. Both arms are supposedly going to be amputated at the shoulders, another customer has reserved his anus, and the final killing is now only days away. He tells customers that anyone who still wants conventional sex with Brad needs to book immediately because the end is in sight. Then a message signed Brad Gordon appears. The writer repeats the ordinary Portland biography that has gradually emerged across several accounts. Brief escort work in Los Angeles, a controlling relationship with Brian, a dangerous encounter, escape to Portland, arson, prison, marriage, a child, and construction work. He says he never wanted to die and wants no further involvement with the website. The writer also proposes an explanation for how Thad entered the story. According to this message, Zach sent his inquiry to an obsolete email address that Brad Gordon no longer used. Another Portland man received it, considered impersonating Brad for the money, and then passed the opportunity to his friend Thad. We cannot independently prove that Brad Gordon wrote this message. The explanation connects the abandoned contact routes, the private correspondence, and Thaddeus Stroh's appearance without requiring Zach to have located the original Brad. Built Like a Truck then supplies a longer, secondhand account of Thad's life. He says Thaddeus Stroh was a 20-year-old former student dealing with depression, addiction, and what friends described as a serious illness. According to a friend named Trent, Thad had become obsessed with the Brad story. He supposedly met Brad Gordon, found the real person disappointing compared with the legend, and decided that he could become the version of Brad the website expected. Now, the illness is never independently verified, and this biography passes through several people before reaching the reader. The name Thaddeus Stroh, the bus reservation, the Portland identifications, the photograph, and the promise of fame all strengthen the conclusion that Site's 2 escort was probably Thad. Review number 11 appears after that identity has become public. Customer claims to have paid for permanent damage to Brad's face and becomes angry after learning that the person may have been Thad. His complaint centers on having purchased the wrong identity. Zach then publicly accepts that the Site 2 escort was Thad. Nearly every remaining appointment is canceled. The one supposed customer who does not care about the escort's real identity is the person scheduled to kill him. Zach moves that appointment forward. Now, someone claiming to be the original Brian posts one final correction. He says he and Brad Gordon were not romantic partners in the way the website imagined. He admits that he attempted to kill Brad and states explicitly that Brad did not want to die. Now, the authorship of that message cannot be verified, but it directly rejects the death wish story that both the original Brian and Zach used to convert violence into supposed fulfillment. From here, the book ends like this. Review number 12 comes from the anonymous customer whom Zach had already scheduled to perform the final killing. He does not care whether the young man is the original Brad, an imposter, or someone else entirely. He only cares that Zach is still providing someone for him to kill. According to the review, the customer arrives at Zach's house and carries out the appointment. He claims that he kills the immobilized young man, then burns the body and removes what remains so that there will be no second victim for police to find or identify. Zach is still inside the house and knows who the customer is. So the reviewer treats him as a witness who also has to be eliminated. He claims that he shoots Zach once, clears away the remaining evidence of the appointment, and leaves Zach's body behind while taking the young man's remains with him. The reviewer then returns home and describes himself as completely satisfied. In his version, he has received exactly what the website promised: the chance to kill the legendary Brad, followed by a clean escape with no surviving witness and no second body left at the scene. For a moment, the novel appears to end with 2 murders and every major thread closed. But 5 days later, the webmaster reports a different scene. Police reportedly find Zach dead from a single gunshot wound, but they rule the death suicide. They find no evidence that another person had been living in the house and no evidence of a second victim. We never see the police report directly. The information still comes through the webmaster, but the scene he describes does not support the final reviewer's claim that 2 people were killed and 1 body was removed. The webmaster then discovers a delayed email from Zach sent from before he died. In it, Zach says this: he originally believed he had found Brad Gordon, but he later realized the young man was an imposter named Thad. Zach claims that review 1 through 6 describe real appointments. He specifically says that review number 4 left the young man unable to walk. After that appointment, the young man changed his mind and wanted to leave. So Zach refused to release him, but later Thad escaped, apparently with another person's help. Zach says that once Thad was gone and the appointments he claims were genuine had stopped, he began writing the reviews himself. He claims responsibility for every later review except review number 9, the separate Portland post identifying the photographed person as Thad. He invented the escalating operations, the additional injuries, and the final double murder because the real story had stopped producing new material and the audience continued demanding a conclusive ending. Zach asked the webmaster not to reveal his confession. He wants the readers to believe that Brad's story ended in the death they had been promised. He wants them to feel that they got what they wanted. But of course, this delayed email still reaches us through the webmaster. Zach is a proven liar. He cannot independently establish every detail of the first 6 appointments, explain who helped Thad escape, or tell us why Zach died. But it explains the surviving evidence more coherently than the final murder review does. The email lines up with several things we already saw. The same person appearing across early reviews, Zach's announcement that the escort can no longer walk, photograph, review 9's separate Portland identification, the sudden escalation after review 6, and the report that police found Zach alone. None of that proves the email is true, but it gives Zach's confession more support than the final murder review has. By the end of Site 2, the final murder review no longer holds together. The evidence now points toward 2 different people, Brad Gordon and Thaddeus Stroh, with Zach using one man's legend to sell the other. But before choosing the most likely explanation, we need to separate what the ending actually supports from what still depends on Zach's word. So that's the end of the novel, but it's not the end of the mystery. We still could not prove who wrote every message, how literally to read every detail of the first 6 reviews, whether Thad was seriously ill, who helped him escape, why Zach died, or how much the webmaster truly verified. So now that we have followed the post all the way to the end, let's stop moving chronologically and break down everything that we actually know. What survived Zach's confession, what was probably fabricated, and what remains impossible to resolve. So here is Case File 5. What survives the ending? Before I tell you what I think actually happened, let's freeze the evidence exactly where it stands and separates what is strongly supported from what is still speculation. First, we have the probable timeline attached to Brad Gordon, our strongest candidate for the original Site 1 Brad. A young escort using the name Brad appears in Los Angeles. He becomes connected to the original Brian, enters a controlling and increasingly dangerous relationship, survives at least one extreme encounter, escapes back to Portland, works construction, commits arson, goes to prison, becomes involved with the lane, and later appears to attempt something resembling an ordinary life. Several people disagree about what Brad was like. Some describe him as vulnerable, others describe him as manipulative, violent, addicted, or impossible to control. But the broad Portland sequence survives sources who otherwise hate and contradict one another. A later message signed Brad Gordon repeats that same biography. The writer says Brad never wanted to die and wants nothing more to do with the website. That message fits the surviving timeline, but we still cannot prove Brad Gordon actually wrote it. Now, the second timeline belongs to Thaddeus Stroh. That name first appears during the private correspondence when the person answering as Brad says his bus ticket has to match the name on his identification, Thaddeus Stroh. Then Site 2 gives us a photograph. Review 5 secretly photographs the escort being sold as Brad. Sandman 808 says the photograph shows the same person he met during Review 1, which strongly connects the early Site 2 appointments to one body. The Portland poster says that body is not Brad Gordon. They identify him as Thad. Now, Review 9 becomes especially important here. Its writer claims he knew and hired Thad several times in Portland. He remembers Thad describing himself as doomed, but says that shortly before disappearing, Thad became unusually optimistic and announced that he was finally going to become famous. The webmaster says he verified contact and enough familiarity to believe the reviewer genuinely knew the person in the photograph. Also specifically excludes Review 9 from the reviews he later admits fabricating. None of that gives us absolute external proof. Taken together, the identification name, the bus reservation, the photograph, the Portland witnesses, and Review 9, that becomes the strongest identification for the Site 2 escort. Connecting those 2 timelines is Zach, the person who turns one man's biography and another man's body into the new Brad. He enters the board as the gay journalist. He impersonates Brian. He uses other accounts. He studies every version of Brad the community has created. Then he reaches the private correspondent, continues pretending to be Brian, and eventually markets that person publicly under Brad's name. So Zach does not need to find the original Brad Gordon. He only needs to find someone willing or desperate enough to perform the role. Now we get to the early Site 2 appointments. Zach's delayed email claims that reviews 1 through 6 describe real appointments. Review 4 alleges catastrophic injuries, while the escort is so intoxicated that, according to the reviewer, cannot understand what is happening. Zach later announces that both legs are in casts and that the young man cannot walk or stand without help. Review 5 finds him immobilized and supplies the photograph. Review 6 describes continued access while that same person remains immobilized. Then Zach makes one of his most important admissions. He says that after Review 4, Thad changed his mind and wanted to leave. Zach admits that he refused to release him. He claims Thad eventually escaped with someone's help. After Thad's reported escape, Zach says he fabricated Review 7, 8, 10, 11, and 12, including the increasingly elaborate later injuries in the final story in which both Zach and the escort are murdered. Review 9 remains the major exception. And then there is the reported police scene. The webmaster says Zach was found dead from a single gunshot wound and that authorities ruled his death suicide. According to that account, there was no evidence that another person had been living in the house and no evidence of a second victim. We never see the police report ourselves. Everything still reaches us through the webmaster. But the scene he describes does not support Review 12's claim that a customer murdered both Zach and the escort. So where does that leave us? There are still major things we cannot prove. Who wrote every private message, whether every detail in Reviews 1 through 6 is true, the exact extent of the injuries and medical treatment, which intoxicants were used, whether Thad was seriously ill, who helped him escape, what happened to him afterward, and why Zach died. But there are 4 claims that are much better supported than their alternatives. 1. Brad Gordon probably existed and is the strongest candidate for the original Site 1 Brad. 2. The person sold as Brad on Site 2 was probably Thaddeus Stroh. 3. Serious violence and exploitation probably occurred during the early Site 2 appointments. And 4. The final murder of the Site 2 escort was probably fabricated. Those are the pieces. The next question is, how do they fit together? The way I see it, there are 5 realistic ways to explain this novel. And I'm going to rank them from the explanation I find least convincing, the one I think comes closest to solving the entire thing. The book is ambiguous, but that does not mean every explanation is equally likely. I'm ranking these theories by 2 things: how much evidence they explain, and how many extra assumptions they need to work. Number 5. The final murder review was real. This is the most literal reading of the ending. The final customer really arrives. He kills the person being sold as Brad. He kills Zach. He removes the escort's body, clears away the evidence, and escapes. Police then find only Zach, mistake his murder for suicide, and somehow miss every sign that another person had been living there. Zach's delayed email would have to be forged, planted, falsely dated, or badly misrepresented by the webmaster. Technically, this is possible. We never see the investigation directly, so the novel never allows us to eliminate it with 100% certainty. But almost everything has to go exactly the right way. The reported police scene has to be false or incomplete. The absence of a second body has to mean nothing. Zach's entire delayed account has to be a fabrication. The reported escape has to be invented. And the later reviews have to be real, even though their style, escalation, and timing fit Zach's confession. But the final murder does technically survive as a possibility because Cooper refuses to give us absolute certainty. The available evidence does not make it likely. So I put it at number 5. Number 4. Every Brad was the same person. This theory gives us one very tragic protagonist moving through the entire novel. Brad, Steve, Kevin, Brad Gordon, the private correspondent, Thad, and Site 2 Brad are all one person using different names, changing stories, and reinventing himself depending on what he needs. Now I understand why this theory is appealing. The same traits keep returning. A very young appearance, tics, addiction, abandonment, fear, unstable behavior, extreme sexual performance, and a willingness to become whatever another person wants in exchange for care, money, housing, or attention. The book also proves that identities can move. Steve allegedly uses Brad's name. Zach becomes Brian. Thad is marketed as Brad. But making everyone one person requires us to ignore way too much. Kevin has a separate agency history. Stevie has his own career, illness, identity, and reported death. Portland's sources reject the Site 2 photograph as Brad Gordon. Review 9 identifies the photographed person as Thad, and the same Thaddeus Stroh appears during the travel arrangements before Site 2 even opens. One person carrying every tragedy would be narratively clean, easy to follow, fun, but the evidence just isn't there. Number 3. Zach authored almost everything, so this is the full mastermind theory. Zach does not merely manipulate the board, he creates nearly the entire crowd. Brian, customers, journalists, witnesses, skeptics, insiders, and maybe even some of the people supposedly exposing him. Then, after building the legend himself, he recruits a real vulnerable person and turns that fiction into a business. This theory actually has real power because Zach proves he can manufacture corroboration. He posts as the gay journalist, he impersonates Brian, he admits using other accounts, he creates evidence, answers objections, interviews himself, and allows one fake identity to confirm another. It's smart. He understands that a lie feels more believable when several different voices appear to agree. But the theory is just a little bit too large. Zach never claims to have created Site 1. To make him responsible for everything, Brad Gordon's Portland history, Elaine, the original Brian, Stevie, Kevin, Ren, the arson conviction, and the early escort reviews all have to become Zach. Collaborators or facts he somehow stole and reorganized. I believe that Zach did not create the entire world of the novel. He studied it, entered it, and hijacked it. He's the largest proven liar in the book, but the evidence does not support him turning into every other person on the screen. That puts this theory at number 3. Number 2, Brad was only ever a composite. This explanation says there was never one original Brad underneath the story. Instead, the name was assembled from several real escorts, lies, rumors, public facts, and repeated details. One poster contributes the tics, another the young appearance, and others add pumpers, Brian, illness, addiction, prison, a death wish, or a controlling older man. Later posters recycle those details until Brad feels less like one person and more like a large checklist. That would actually explain the conflicting heights, weights, eye colors, personalities, medical histories, and locations. It would also explain how several customers could describe completely different bodies while believing they had met the same person. By Site 2, Zach would not need to locate the original Brad. He would only need someone who matched enough of the legend. The problem with this theory is that it removes the original person completely, and that just goes a little bit too far. The earliest reviews repeat a fairly specific cluster: Long Beach, pumpers, a young-looking escort, physical tics, intoxication, and eventually Brian. Then the Portland Brad Gordon biography remains surprisingly coherent across people who disagree about almost everything else. So I think Brad did become a composite, but I don't think he came from nothing. It probably started with a real person. That makes this the second best explanation. Now we go to the most likely explanation, and the one that I think most of you will agree with. Number 1. Brad Gordon, then Thad, with Zach hijacking the legend. This comes close to solving the entire novel, but it doesn't solve everything. There's still just a few gaps. So I think that the original Brad was probably Brad Gordon. He was a very young-looking escort working around Los Angeles, probably connected to pumpers, with severe physical tics, addiction problems, and unstable behavior. Then he met an older man that we know as Brian. Brian found him through the website and offered what could look like rescue. Money, housing, addiction, stability, attention, and somewhere to belong. But rescue became control. Brian managed Brad's money, living situation, appointments, public story, and access to other people. The terminal brain tumor story was a lie. Maybe Brian invented it, maybe Brad and Brian developed it together as a fantasy, maybe Brad sometimes performed the role because it gave him attention and increased his value to customers. Whoever came up with it, it gave Brian an excuse. If Brad was already dying and supposedly wanted this, then Brian could call control care, and he could call violence mercy. Even Brad's inability to safely leave could be twisted into proof that he wanted to stay. At least one of the extreme encounters probably occurred. Ren's exact role remains uncertain, but several competing accounts preserve the same basic center. Brian arranged an extreme scene involving another man, Brad was seriously harmed, and the distinction between negotiated roleplay and attempted killing collapsed. Brian later admits carrying out another severe attack himself, but Brad survived. That's when he escaped and returned to Portland. This is where the Brad Gordon timeline becomes much more grounded. Lane, construction work, addiction, conflict, arson, prison, release, and some attempt at a normal life afterward. Different sources describe Brad in completely different moral terms. Some pity him, some hate him, some describe him as dangerous, manipulative, or impossible, but they keep repeating the same broad Portland biography. That makes Brad Gordon the strongest anchor for the original person behind the legend. Once Brad Gordon's story reaches the board, it becomes public mythology, and Zach studies which details make people believe. He uses multiple accounts, impersonates Brian, follows an obsolete contact connected to Brad, and reaches a person who knows the Portland biography, but gives the name Thaddeus Stroh during the bus arrangements. And that's the split that I think matters the most. Zach probably did not recover the original Brad. He found Thad, someone vulnerable enough, interested enough, or desperate enough to perform the role for money, drugs, housing, attention, fame, or some combination. Zach brought him to Los Angeles, became the new Brian, and sold him as Brad. First 6 Site 2 reviews then appear to follow that same person through escalating harm. Review 4's injuries, Zach's announcement about the cast, Review 5's photograph, and Review 6's continued access. According to Zach, Thad then wanted to leave, and Zach refused. Whatever arrangement existed before that moment ended. Then the photograph escapes the business. Portland sources identify the person as Thad. The original Brad Gordon is reported alive elsewhere. Customers begin canceling, not because someone had been horribly injured, but because the injured person may not be the authentic Brad they believed they purchased. According to Zach's delayed email, Thad later escapes with help. And once Thad is gone, Zach loses the body, but keeps the story. He fabricated reviews 7, 8, 10, 11, and 12. He writes the escalating injuries, he writes the final murder. He gives the audience the ending it has been demanding since Site 1. Then Zach himself is found dead. The webmaster reports suicide, but the novel never gives us enough evidence to know why Zach died, or whether the reported explanation is complete. That is the sequence I think best fits the evidence. I think Zach did kill himself to give everyone the story they wanted. But that depends heavily on Zach's delayed email, and there is one huge problem with that. Zach is a proven liar. His delayed email may be one final attempt to control how the story ends. Conveniently preserves the first 6 appointments as real, moves the most extreme later claims into fiction, and gives the missing escort an escape instead of a body. It is completely possible that Zach fabricated much more of Site 2 than he admits. I don't trust the email simply because Zach wrote it. I think it lines up because the evidence fits. The early continuity between customers, Zach's announcement about the cast, the photograph, the separate evidence surrounding Review 9, the noticeable change in the later reviews, and the reported absence of a second victim at Zach's house. So this is the explanation that necessitates the least invention to believe. I think this is what best explains the novel. Brad Gordon did exist. Legend grew around him. Thad inherited the role. Zach turned that substitution into a business. Some of the early violence did occur. Thad escaped, and Zach probably replaced an unresolved survival with the clean, dramatic murder that the audience had trained him to write. So the later murders may have been fake, but the suffering was not. That makes this explanation so much worse than the simple version where everything was only a hoax. Incredibly disturbing, a slap in the face. Great job, Dennis Cooper. So that is my best answer to what happened. This fucked me up. There were sections where I had to stop reading because I felt disgusting. There were sections where I was laughing because the lies had become so ridiculous. And there were sections where I was sitting there with my mouth open, trying to figure out whether I was reading a hoax, a confession, a fantasy, or evidence that someone had actually been hurt. What's fun about this book is that usually solving a mystery makes it less frightening, but here it made everything so much worse. Brad begins as a row on a review form: age, height, weight, price, limits, and whether the customer would hire him again. The first reviewer notices that Brad looks too young, needs alcohol, seems detached, and is physically unwell. None of those warnings are hidden. He simply interprets all of them in whatever way allows him to keep going. That's basically a miniature version of the book. From that first review onward, people talking about Brad begin building him together. Different posters keep the youthful appearance, the tics, the illness, the death wish, the abuse, or the secret identity, and add whatever makes their version more exciting. Eventually, the bodies, heights, personalities, and names can all change while Brad remains recognizable because everyone knows which details to repeat. The Sluts was published before social media became what it is now, but it feels like it understood the next 20 years of the internet perfectly. A lie doesn't need to come from one convincing person anymore. One person can create 10 accounts. 10 strangers can repeat one false claim. Rumor can be confirmed because another anonymous user says he heard the same thing. Someone can pose as a journalist, interview himself under another username, answer his own objections, and point to the exchange as proof. That is Zach's method. He doesn't need truth, only the appearance of a crowd. Once that crowd exists, repetition starts looking like evidence. The book understands that anonymity does more than hide people. It lets them become someone else, often the worst version of themselves. With no real-world face or consequence attached, users joke about murder, discuss buying access to an injured teenager, argue over who deserves to kill him, and call it concern, research, rescue, skepticism, or entertainment. This is like a version of the internet where everyone believes nothing can be traced back to them. Most people on the board probably are not killers, and that's what makes it worse. They go to work, they have friends, they seem completely normal. They log on under a username and discuss another person shared like a toy. Horror isn't that monsters exists. It's that a crowd can make monstrous behavior feel normal. It escalates one post at a time. Somebody says something disgusting, someone else laughs, the next poster takes it further. Customers move from hiring Brad to buying private information, photographs. There's rescue attempts, injury, and death. By the time the board openly admits that it wants to kill Brad, the idea has been normalized through a dozen smaller steps. Cooper makes us sit inside this disturbing world that we actually live in but want to pretend that we don't. He rubs our faces in the filth again and again. There were times when I thought, I get it, you can stop. He just kept going. So that was The Sluts by Dennis Cooper. This is probably the most work I have ever put into understanding one book. We started with one review of an escort named Brad, and ended with 2 websites, dozens of usernames, several possible Brads, multiple Brians, fabricated murder, stories, reported deaths, photograph, an impersonator, and a confession that may itself be another lie. I built the map, I separated the names, I ranked the explanations. I think I got as close to the truth as the book allows. This fucked me up, I've said it several times. I mean that as both a warning and a compliment. It made this fake old message board feel more real than most of the actual internet. And I don't think I'm ever going to forget this. Final horror is not that we never learn exactly who Brad was. It's that once Brad became a good enough story, almost nobody cared who was inside the name. And after spending this many hours trying to solve him, I think that was the answer all along. It doesn't matter.